It's a small village somewhere in rural Europe, sometime in the 1800s, and a mother is standing over her child's crib in the middle of the night, staring down in complete terror. Just yesterday, in the morning light, her baby's eyes looked golden brown. Today, under the dim candlelight, they look almost green, with strange flecks of gold scattered around the edges. The eyes look different, not slightly different, actually different, shifting, changing, like something inside them is alive and moving. And in a time when superstition ruled everyday life, when unexplained things were blamed on spirits, curses, and fairies, this kind of change was terrifying. In parts of European folklore, a child whose features seemed to shift or change in ways that couldn't be explained was sometimes suspected of being a changeling, a fairy child secretly swapped in place of the real human baby. And families who believed this were sometimes driven to horrifying extremes trying to force the real child to return. Now imagine being that mother, staring down at your own baby, watching their eyes seem to shift color depending on the light, the room, the time of day, and not having a single scientific explanation for why. That fear, that confusion, that complete lack of answers is exactly the kind of mystery that surrounded one of the strangest and most misunderstood eye colors in human history. Hazel eyes, not brown, not green, not blue. Something else entirely, something that seems to change right in front of you, and for most of human history, absolutely nobody could explain why. But now, finally, modern DNA science has cracked open the real answer, and it involves ancient migration routes, a specific genetic mutation, and one of the most genetically complicated eye colors that exists anywhere on the planet. Stick with me, because hazel eyes are not just a color. They're basically a genetic puzzle that took scientists decades to even partially solve. Let's start with the basic facts, because hazel eyes occupy a strange, in-between space that most people don't fully understand. Globally, hazel eyes are found in roughly 5% of the world's population, making them noticeably rarer than brown eyes, but slightly more common than pure green eyes. That puts hazel in this unusual middle zone, rare enough to stand out, common enough that most people have met someone with hazel eyes at some point in their life, but still mysterious enough that even eye doctors and geneticists sometimes disagree on exactly where the line between hazel, green, and light brown actually sits. And that disagreement isn't just some minor technicality. It gets right to the heart of what makes hazel eyes so genetically fascinating in the first place, because unlike brown eyes, which are relatively straightforward, and blue eyes, which trace back to one specific, well-understood genetic mutation, hazel eyes are not one single consistent color at all. They are a shifting, layered blend, and the reason they shift is written directly into the structure of the iris itself. So let's talk about what's actually happening inside a hazel eye, because this is genuinely one of the more beautiful pieces of human biology once you understand it. Just like every other eye color, hazel eyes are determined by melanin, the same brown-black pigment responsible for skin and hair color. There is no special hazel pigment sitting inside the eye. There's only melanin, and how much of it is present, and how it's distributed throughout the iris. In brown eyes, melanin is present in large amounts, spread fairly evenly, which absorbs most incoming light and gives the eye that deep, uniform brown color. In blue eyes, melanin is almost completely absent, and the blue appearance comes entirely from a phenomenon called Rayleigh scattering, the exact same optical effect that makes the sky look blue, where light bounces around inside a low pigment iris and scatters back out as blue light. Hazel eyes sit in a genuinely unique position on this spectrum. They contain a moderate amount of melanin, not high like brown, not nearly absent like blue, but they contain it unevenly, distributed in patches and layers, rather than spread out consistently across the whole iris. Higher concentrations of melanin often sit closer to the outer rim of the iris, while lower concentrations sit closer to the pupil. And it's this uneven, layered distribution combined with that same light scattering effect that creates the shifting, multi-toned appearance that makes hazel eyes so distinctive. Depending on the angle of the light, the color of your clothing, the environment around you, or even your mood and the size of your pupil, hazel eyes can appear to shift between green, gold, brown, and amber tones, sometimes within the same conversation. That's not an illusion. That's not people imagining things. That's real physical light interacting differently with an iris that has pigment sitting in uneven pockets, rather than one consistent layer. A lot of hazel eyes also show something called a sunburst pattern, a ring of golden or amber color radiating outward from the pupil, gradually blending into green or brown tones toward the outer edge of the iris. This pattern happens because melanin concentration genuinely differs between the inner and outer regions of the iris, in people with this specific combination of genetic variants, creating those radiating lines and flecks that give hazel eyes their layered, almost three-dimensional look. It's honestly one of the most visually complex things the human eye can naturally produce, and for centuries, people had absolutely no idea why it existed. They just knew that some people's eyes seemed to have a kind of restless, shifting quality that other eye colors simply didn't have. And in a world without genetics, without microscopes powerful enough to study melanin distribution, that restlessness got filled in with folklore, superstition, and fear. Now let's dig into the genetics, because this is where hazel eyes go from interesting to genuinely mind-bending. Just like green and blue eyes, hazel eyes trace back primarily to two genes sitting next to each other on chromosome 15, called OCA2 and HERC2. OCA2 is the gene responsible for actually producing melanin inside the iris, and on its own, it accounts for a huge chunk of human eye color variation. HERC2 sits right beside it and functions almost like a volume control, a genetic switch that regulates exactly how active OCA2 is allowed to be. Turn that switch all the way up, and you get high melanin production, resulting in brown eyes. Turn it all the way down, and OCA2 barely produces any melanin at all, resulting in blue eyes. But hazel eyes involves something more specific and more delicate than just landing in a vague middle position. Researchers have identified a particular genetic variant, a single nucleotide polymorphism sitting directly inside the OCA2 gene itself, that's associated specifically with the moderate, uneven melanin levels behind hazel and green eyes. It's a slightly different, less severe genetic variation than the one responsible for the dramatic melanin reduction seen in blue eyes, and it works alongside a whole additional cluster of supporting genes, including regions like SLC24A4, TYR, TYRP1, and IRF4, each contributing small nudges that influence exactly how the melanin ends up distributed across the iris. In total, scientists now believe at least 16 different genes play some role in shaping human eye color, and hazel eyes appear to require one of the most complicated combinations of all of them, which is exactly why hazel doesn't behave like a clean, predictable, single-gene trait the way people were once taught in basic biology classes. This complexity has a direct, real-world effect on how hazel eyes get passed down through families, and it genuinely surprises a lot of people. For a long time, basic biology education taught that brown eyes were simply dominant and blue eyes were simply recessive, as if eye color worked like a straightforward coin flip between two options. We now know that's a massive oversimplification. Because so many genes are involved in determining hazel eyes specifically, inheritance doesn't follow a clean, predictable pattern at all. Two brown-eyed parents can absolutely have a hazel-eyed child if both parents happen to be silently carrying some of the specific recessive variants needed to produce that moderate, uneven melanin pattern hidden quietly underneath their own dominant brown eye genetics. And here's the part that really throws people off. Two hazel-eyed parents are not guaranteed to have a hazel-eyed child either. Because the final result depends on which exact combination of dozens of possible genetic variants each parent happens to pass along, two parents with hazel eyes could end up with a child who has green eyes, brown eyes, or even blue eyes, depending entirely on how the genetic dice happen to land. This is exactly why hazel eyes can seem to appear completely out of nowhere in a family tree, showing up in one child, while every sibling has clearly brown or blue eyes, simply because that one child happened to inherit the very specific, narrow combination of variants required to land in that moderate, unevenly pigmented middle zone. There's also a fascinating early life twist to this story that catches a lot of parents completely off guard. Many babies, regardless of what their eventual adult eye color will be, are actually born with blue or grayish eyes because melanin production in the iris hasn't fully ramped up yet at birth. Over the following 1 to 3 years of a child's life, melanin production gradually increases, and the eyes slowly darken and settle into their long-term color. Some babies, who start out with that pale, bluish newborn look, eventually end up with hazel eyes once their melanin production settles into that intermediate range, which means a lot of parents spend the first year or two of their child's life watching their baby's eyes slowly transform in real time, shifting from pale blue toward a warmer, layered hazel tone, without any dramatic genetic event happening at all, just melanin quietly building up exactly as it was always programmed to. And even once hazel eyes stabilize in early childhood, they don't necessarily stay perfectly fixed for the rest of a person's life. In older adults, the iris can gradually lose some pigment over the decades, occasionally causing hazel eyes to appear slightly lighter or more muted later in life than they did in youth, adding yet another layer to how genuinely dynamic this eye color can be across an entire human lifespan. Now let's zoom out and talk about where hazel eyes actually come from historically, because the geography here tells an incredible story about ancient human migration. Just like blue and green eyes, hazel eyes trace back to that same ancient genetic event scientists believe occurred somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. A single mutation in the regulatory region of the HERC2 gene that dramatically reduced OCA2 activity for the very first time in human history. Before that mutation appeared, researchers believe every single human being on Earth had brown eyes, full stop, no exceptions. Brown was universal for tens of thousands of years, across every population on every continent. Then, in one individual, most likely somewhere near the Black Sea region of southeastern Europe, that one random genetic copying error occurred, and it began quietly spreading through the population, generation after generation, as ancient humans migrated, intermarried, and carried that mutation with them across the continent. Hazel eyes represent one of the many branching outcomes of that original mutation, a slightly less extreme variation than the one that produced pure blue eyes, combined with additional supporting genetic modifiers that pushed the melanin distribution into that moderate, unevenly patterned middle zone instead. But hazel eyes have an extra layer to their geographic story that green and blue eyes don't share quite as strongly, and it has everything to do with ancient trade routes and cultural crossroads. While blue eyes cluster heavily in Northern Europe, and green eyes cluster heavily in places like Ireland, Scotland, and Hungary, hazel eyes show a particularly strong concentration in regions that historically sat at the crossroads of multiple ancient civilizations, places like Lebanon, Turkey, Iran, and parts of North Africa, including Morocco and Algeria. These regions functioned for thousands of years as genuine meeting points connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa, hubs of constant trade, migration, conquest, and cultural exchange between vastly different populations. And that centuries-long blending of Mediterranean, Arab, Persian, and European ancestries appears to have created exactly the kind of diverse genetic mixing needed to produce hazel eyes at consistently higher rates than almost anywhere else on Earth. Hazel eyes are also relatively common in parts of South America, particularly Brazil and Argentina, regions with their own deep, complicated histories of population mixing between European colonizers, indigenous peoples, and other migrating groups over the past several centuries. In a very real sense, hazel eyes are almost like a living genetic record of human crossroads, showing up most often in exactly the places where different ancient populations spent the longest time mixing, intermarrying, and blending their genetic material together. This connects to something genuinely remarkable that scientists have discovered by studying ancient DNA extracted directly from prehistoric human remains. Researchers analyzing genetic material from skeletons thousands of years old have found that early hunter-gatherer populations in Europe and Western Asia carried a much broader and more surprising range of eye color genetics than anyone originally assumed. Some ancient hunter-gatherer groups, according to this research, carried genes associated with lighter eyes long before the spread of agriculture across the continent, meaning light and intermediate eye colors were already quietly present in certain ancient populations earlier than previously believed. As these different ancient groups moved across continents, encountered each other, intermarried, and blended their populations together over thousands of years, entirely new genetic combinations formed that hadn't existed before. And hazel eyes, with their requirement for such a specific, layered combination of multiple genetic variants, appear to have become especially likely to emerge during exactly these long periods of population mixing. In other words, hazel eyes may be, in a very real biological sense, one of the clearest genetic fingerprints of ancient human migration and mixing that exists anywhere in the human eye color spectrum. A living reminder written into the iris of millions of people that their ancestors came from populations that met, mixed, and blended together somewhere along an ancient migration route thousands of years ago. Now let's go back to that folklore fear we opened with, because once you understand the real science, the old superstitions start to make a strange kind of sense, even though they were completely wrong about the actual cause. For most of human history, people had zero understanding of melanin, genetics, or light scattering. All they had was direct observation, and what they observed with hazel eyes was genuinely unlike anything else. A brown eye stayed brown, a blue eye stayed blue. But a hazel eye seemed to shift, seemed to change depending on the light, depending on the season, depending on what the person was wearing, sometimes even depending on their mood or their emotional state. In a world steeped in superstition, where unexplained physical differences were routinely blamed on spirits, curses, and supernatural interference, an eye color that genuinely appeared to change in front of your face was bound to attract suspicion. Across various European folk traditions, unusual or shifting physical features in infants and children were sometimes connected to changeling folklore, the belief that fairies or other supernatural beings had secretly swapped a human baby for one of their own, leaving behind a child who looked almost right, but carried some subtle, unsettling difference that marked them as not fully human. Families who genuinely believed their child had been swapped sometimes subjected that child to horrifying rituals meant to drive out the supposed fairy spirit and force the return of their real baby. A tragic and well-documented pattern of folk belief that caused real, devastating harm to real families across parts of rural Europe for centuries. While eye color alone was rarely the sole trigger for these beliefs, the broader climate of fear around unexplained physical difference meant that something as visually striking as genuinely shifting eye color would have added yet another layer of unease in communities already primed to see the unexplainable as dangerous or supernatural. Beyond the darker folklore, hazel eyes also picked up a reputation across many cultures as something mysterious, unpredictable, and almost untrustworthy, specifically because they seem to defy easy categorization. Human beings have always had a psychological tendency to feel more comfortable with things that are clearly one category or another. Clearly brown, clearly blue, clearly this or clearly that. Hazel eyes refused to fit neatly into a single box, and that ambiguity got translated across different eras and cultures into ideas about people with hazel eyes being complex, unpredictable, secretive, or hard to read. Personality traits that had absolutely nothing to do with actual genetics, but got attached to the eye color anyway, simply because the color itself felt so genuinely unclassifiable. You can still see traces of this cultural pattern today, in how hazel eyes are frequently described in modern pop culture and casual conversation as mysterious, captivating, or impossible to pin down. Language that echoes centuries of people trying to make sense of an eye color that scientifically resists simple, single-word description. Now let's bring this into the modern era, because the exact same scientific tools that have finally explained hazel eyes are also being actively used in forensic science today. Using genetic markers concentrated around that HERC2 and OCA2 region, along with supporting markers scattered across those additional 16 or so genes involved in eye color, forensic geneticists have developed prediction models capable of estimating a person's likely eye color directly from a DNA sample, sometimes using nothing more than a trace amount of biological material left behind at a crime scene. This technology, known as forensic DNA phenotyping, has genuinely been used in real criminal investigations to help narrow down physical descriptions of unknown suspects using nothing but their genetic material. But here's where hazel eyes create a genuinely fascinating challenge for this technology. Because hazel eyes require such an intricate, layered combination of multiple genetic variants working together, rather than one clean, dominant genetic switch the way blue eyes do, they remain one of the hardest eye colors for forensic scientists to predict with complete accuracy. A DNA sample might strongly suggest a person has light-colored eyes overall, but distinguishing precisely between a light hazel, a golden hazel, and a true green can still trip up even sophisticated modern prediction models, precisely because the genetic architecture behind hazel eyes is so much messier and more distributed than the relatively straightforward genetics behind blue or brown. In a strange way, hazel eyes are still holding onto a small piece of their ancient mystery, resisting even our most advanced genetic technology the same way they resisted simple explanation for thousands of years of human history. There's also a fascinating overlap between hazel eyes and broader questions about human health that most people never think to ask. Because hazel eyes contain a moderate level of melanin, they generally offer somewhat more natural protection against ultraviolet light compared to blue or light green eyes, though still less than the dense, high melanin protection found in dark brown eyes. This places hazel eyes in an interesting middle zone even when it comes to sun sensitivity, generally more resistant to glare and UV exposure than the palest eye colors, but still not quite as naturally protected as deep brown. Some researchers studying pigmentation genetics more broadly have pointed out that the same genetic pathways controlling iris melanin levels are connected to melanin production throughout the rest of the body, meaning eye color can sometimes offer subtle clues about a person's broader pigmentation genetics, though it's important to understand this connection is general and statistical rather than something that applies predictably to every individual case. Culturally, hazel eyes have carved out their own unique space in art, literature, and modern beauty standards, distinct from the mystique surrounding pure green or pure blue eyes. Because hazel eyes genuinely shift in appearance depending on lighting and surroundings, they've become strongly associated in modern culture with ideas of complexity, depth, and multidimensional beauty, the kind of eye color that seems to reveal something slightly different every time you look at it. Colored contact lens companies have specifically developed hazel-toned lenses precisely because so many people find that layered, shifting quality more captivating than a single, flat, uniform color, chasing an aesthetic that took actual human genetics tens of thousands of years of accidental combination to produce naturally. It's a strange thing to sit with, that an eye color once viewed with suspicion, tied loosely to fears of the supernatural and the unexplainable, has become, in the modern world, something people actively spend money trying to replicate for themselves. So let's zoom all the way back out and look at the full, improbable chain of events required for hazel eyes to exist in any single human being alive today. It starts with that same ancient genetic accident scientists believe occurred somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, most likely near the Black Sea region, a single random mutation in the HERC2 gene that, for the first time in human history, began reducing OCA2 activity and dialing down melanin production in the iris. That mutation then had to survive and spread across thousands of years of human migration, carried along ancient trade routes and population movements stretching from Europe through the Middle East and into North Africa, regions that would go on to become exactly the crossroads where hazel eyes appear most frequently today. Along the way, that original mutation had to combine in very specific family lines with an entire additional stack of supporting genetic variants scattered across more than a dozen different genes, all of them needing to land in exactly the right combination to produce that moderate, unevenly distributed melanin pattern, rather than sliding toward the more extreme, cleaner outcomes of pure blue or solid brown. And finally, two people, at some point each carrying pieces of that exact rare combination, had to meet, form a family, and pass those specific variants down together into one child in one moment, continuing a genetic story that had already been quietly unfolding for thousands of years before that child was ever born. That mother standing over her baby's crib in the candlelight, terrified by eyes that seemed to shift color overnight, had absolutely no way of knowing that what she was witnessing wasn't a curse, wasn't a fairy swap, and wasn't anything supernatural at all. She was witnessing one of the most genetically complicated and quietly beautiful outcomes the human body is capable of producing. A color built from ancient migration, ancient mixing, and a fragile layered combination of genetic variants that took thousands of years and countless generations to finally align. The fear was misplaced. The superstition was wrong. But the sense of wonder, the feeling that something genuinely mysterious was happening right in front of her eyes, that part was completely justified. Because hazel eyes really are one of the most scientifically complex and genetically rare outcomes in the entire human genome, and it took modern DNA science, unraveling a mystery 10,000 years in the making, to finally explain why some eyes simply refuse to stay the same color twice.